Hello, good evening, welcome. Thank you everybody for joining. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're healthy and happy. Chassidus requires us and emphasizes the Jewish value of happiness and joyfulness at all times. So I hope you're joyful and happy, and I hope there's plenty to be happy about and to thank God for. Again, thank you for joining, and we'll get right to it. As a brief introduction, and just to kind of set the mood a little bit, one of the main points that Hasidus in general attempts to accomplish, and one of the certainly main ideas here of the book of Tanya, is to make godliness a reality to the world, to merge the two a little bit more, and not so much to bring God close to the world, or to bring God down to the world, because God is already here, close to us, one with us. But rather, the Alter Rebbe attempts to bring the world closer to God. And what that means is that the world should become aware of the godly reality, which is. It's not that God has to come close to us. He is already close to us, as we've been talking and will continue to explain. Rather, the purpose here is that we should become more aware of his reality in the world, which means to bring the world up to godliness, or to make the world more aware of the godly reality. So in this context, the Alter Rebbe says that if we are able to make ourselves more aware of the godly reality, which is, if we're able to make the faith that we have in God, the faith that we have in one God, and that God created the world and created us and has a mission and a purpose for us, and there's a reason why we live, and there's a reason for what we need to do, even every day and every moment of the day, then if we're able to make that a reality in our lives, in other words, it's not just something that we believe in, but it's something that we know, it's something that we understand to the best of our ability, that completely changes the ballgame. It completely changes the dynamic. And it allows us to function on a much more productive and powerful level in all aspects of life, and from the perspective that we're going to discuss from a spiritual perspective. But this kind of perspective on life really helps in every avenue of our lives. That's in family life and in work and in all things that we're involved. So let's get straight to it. We're in the middle of chapter 21, and a brief summary. The Alter Rebbe is discussing, the author of the Tanya is discussing, how can every single person, every individual, every Jew, how can we use the reality that God is close to us, as we've been saying? How do we make ourselves more aware of that godly reality? How do we bring ourselves closer to God? Is to understand and to know and to believe and to become aware that godliness already exists within us. We already have a neshama, what's called in Hebrew, a soul, and that soul is a part of godliness. And that soul essentially is the love, what he calls the hidden love, the ahava misuteret, the hidden love that every Jew has to God. And the question that we're in the middle of answering is, how can we awaken that hidden love, that it shouldn't be hidden? How can we use that hidden love, that it should be constantly present and accessible to us, that any time we need that love, it can be used to motivate us to always do the right thing and stay away from the wrong thing. And the Alter Rebbe says this is completely possible by every single individual. This is also another important thing to keep in mind, because many times we learn and we study and we think, oh, you know what, these things are lofty and, they sound beautiful and very inspirational and wonderful. But in reality, I'm not up to it. It doesn't sound like something I can do. And it's certainly a valid thought, but the Alter Rebbe says it's incorrect. Every person is able to get this done. The question is, do we know how? And so the Alter Rebbe here gives us the tools, the skills, the know-how, and how to activate this hidden love within us. And that's the subject that we're in middle of right now. So to answer that question, how do we activate the hidden love? We began to discuss already in the previous chapter and then already in chapter 21, where we've moved on to a different topic. And by understanding this other topic better, we will then come back to our original question, how can we activate this hidden love? Essentially, this other topic is going to help us understand how God is a reality within the world and how our world and our lives and even the details, the minute details within our lives, which we think are even insignificant, even those details are actually godly. They're part of God's reality. They're part of God's infinity. And therefore, they're also infinite in potential. And every single aspect and detail of our lives is holy and is purposeful and is important. And nothing should be ignored. And everything should be used to its fullest. And everything should be used in a positive and in a proper way. So how can we bring that up? He says, let's get into that other topic, which we started, as I said, which is understanding how God is really close to the world. So we started talking about speech. What is the relationship of the world with God to begin with? The relationship of the world with God is that God created it. God made the world. How did he create the world? He created the world by speaking, as we said. God spoke. To quote from Genesis, from Bereshis, "Vayomer Elokim yehi or." It's the first utterance that's referenced as an utterance. Vayomer Elokim, and God said, "Let there be light." That's the most common and most popular descript knowledge of God speaking and saying, "Let there be light," and there was light. Essentially, that's used as a metaphor for how God created the world, which is he used the power of speech. And we discussed at great length the comparison and the relationship between the speech of humans, the speech that we use, that we employ to communicate with each other. We speak, and when we speak, we can communicate our thoughts with other individuals, and those other individuals can internalize those thoughts and benefit from the ideas which before spoken are contained only in the other person's mind. Once they're spoken, they exit the person's mind. The truth is not exit. Let's define that a little bit better. They are expressed and revealed from the person's mind. They're still contained in the mind, right? They don't exit the mind. Those thoughts remain in the person's mind. They're now just being revealed using the tool called speech. And those thoughts are now revealed to another individual via speech. How did God create the world? The same way, he spoke. So what does it mean that he spoke? He revealed the innermost thoughts that he had, and the revelation of those thoughts is what is defined as speech, which means it isn't necessarily the fact that God actually spoke words using a mouth or whatever other talking piece God has, which then created sound waves, which could have been recorded for an example. In other words, is the speech that God used to create the world the exact same as the speech of us human beings? And the answer, of course, is it is not the same. And it's also part of what we discussed last week. And if you haven't listened to it, listen to Tanya classes part 4, which is last week's class, where we discussed that at length. But essentially, we're just recapping today that the speech that God used is different than our speech in the following ways. Not just that it's different because it's godly and we are not godly and our speech is different, but it's different in very, very specific way. First of all, it's different. God's speech is different because God's speech is not separate from him. God's speech is one with him. And if we look at our speech as human beings, our speech is separate from us. What happens when we speak? The ideas which were which were contained only in our mind before we spoke, once we say the words, they're now outside of our mind. They've been revealed from us, and other people are now aware of what was only in our mind before. So speech is a true revelation of the thought, of the ideas of an individual. And when a person speaks, those thoughts can never be concealed again. Those thoughts are now still within the person's mind, but completely separate and independent from them, from the individual, because now another person is aware of those thoughts because the person spoke those words. And now what another person can do is can utilize those thoughts, can build on them, can work on them, can contradict them, can agree with them, can take that information and pass it on to another individual, and so on and so forth, which means as long as I haven't spoken anything or anything that's on my mind, or as long as I haven't spoken of a certain idea that I have, no one will be aware of it. It's completely my own. The moment I speak of it, it's now shared and I can never take it back. I've separated myself from the idea. So as long as, it's true that the idea is still contained within me, but I have shared the idea. And now the idea isn't my own anymore. It's now shared with others. The speech that God uses, when God speaks, there's a very different thing that's happening. God is revealing, that's true. God is revealing, and that's why the Torah uses the word speech, dibur in Hebrew, because it's a revelation, and that's the metaphor that the Torah uses to tell us that creation of the world was a revelation and an expression of God's intellect, of God's wisdom. So it uses the word speech, just like a person reveals their intellect by speaking. So too God revealed his intellect by creating a world, essentially. And that's why it's called speech. But it's different with God because when he speaks, his words don't become separate from him. His words remain one with him, which essentially really means that they're never separate from him, which means he can really take it back, if you will. He can turn off the speech, and it's not like, oh, there's no more speech happening from this moment and forward. But essentially, if he turns it off, then there's no speech that ever happened, even though the speech has been happening and God already created the world, if you will. It's almost like a flow of energy, if you think of it that way. When you turn off the flow of energy, all the energy that's already been extended doesn't remain, because all that energy is still dependent on the source that is feeding that energy. So when you turn off the source, all the energy that's already been extended also vanishes. So essentially that energy is always dependent. It's always really one and connected with its source. The energy doesn't really, even though it's extending further from the source, that energy is still really very much part of the source. A perfect example is the sun and the light of the sun. Those of you who studied Hasidus, basic concepts are familiar with this metaphor. So just quickly, just like the energy metaphor that we just gave, when we think of the sun and when we think of the light that comes from the sun, all the light that comes from the sun isn't the sun, it's the light that comes from the sun. It's very, very far from the sun. In fact, the reason it can be called light, and in fact, the reason that it can be used as light is because it's very far from the sun, is because it's being extended from the sun. If the sun would actually be right here, it would really be a problem. It wouldn't be light. It wouldn't be warm. It would be a lot more than light and warm, much more so than we can handle, and therefore it would be problematic for us, to say the least. Most of us, all of us, I'm sure, understand that concept. So while the light of the sun isn't the sun itself, and the light that we experience on Earth from the sun is actually very, very distant and far away from the sun, nevertheless, the light that we experience from the sun here on Earth is very much dependent on the sun itself. So much so that if the sun were to, for example, turn off, what happens? We don't experience the light anymore. It's gone. Now, is it gone? It's gone from here. We don't experience it. The light is still contained within the sun, or it's somewhere out there. We just don't experience it here because it's being covered, because it's being concealed, or because the sun has turned off. A common example is, of course, cloud cover. A better example, I think, would be an eclipse, which happens rarely, but it does happen. And when the sun is eclipsed by the moon, what happens is that the sun obviously is still shining, and the light of the sun is still emanating from the sun. It's just that there's something in the way, and we don't receive that light. It's just being stopped. So, which means the light isn't really independent from the sun. The light is extending from the sun, very, very distant and far away from the sun, but it's still very much part of the sun. It's still very connected with the sun. So if you think about it that way, that's how God's speech is. God speaks. The metaphor that the Torah uses for creation is speech, because speech is an extension of an idea, an extension of the intellect, further from the self. Just like when we speak, it's my idea, I'm speaking it, and it's being extended outside of me. Someone else is able to receive it and hear it and use it. So to also God's creation is extending that idea from him. The difference is fundamental, though. The difference is that when I speak, the speech is now separate from me. I can never take those words back. Those words are completely independent from me and take on almost a life of their own, if you will. Many times, in fact, words do take on a life of their own. That's part of the power of words. Part of the reason that we need to really be careful of what we say and how we say it, because words are very powerful. In this context, actually, we can really understand why words are so powerful, because words have the power of creation, because God created the world using words. But let's get back to our topic here. So God creates the world also by speaking, meaning not actual words, but ideas, which are purely intellectual, and once they're spoken, essentially, once they're revealed, that process of speech, they're revealed, now there is a world that exists. So that's the difference between God's speech and our speech. Essentially, that when we speak, the words are separate from us. When God speaks, the words are still part of him, which means the revelation, that which has been revealed by speaking, has not become independent from God. It's still part of God. Now, why must we say that? We must say that God's creation, that God's extension of his intellect is still part of him, because, and we ended off last week's class with this topic and with the following question. The speech that God employs to create, which means his revelation and extension of his intellect to create a world, doesn't become independent from him. It remains part of him. It's still an extension, it's still a revelation, but it's still part of him, which then begs the question, then what are we? What is the world? The world, if the world is still part of godliness, so much so that, as we said, the words are still part of him, his revelation is still part of him, he can actually even take it back. And it's as if he never spoke. It's as if creation never even happened if he would do that. Then what are we? And the question we actually ended off with last week is, how can we even say the words? How can there be a reality where God reveals or extends himself? I thought God is infinite. And if God is infinite, infinity can't be extended to something else, because there isn't anything else. God is infinite. Anything that exists is already part of infinity. And as we defined infinity last week, infinite in time, in space, and in matter. So God is infinite in every single aspect and in every single detail. So it's not like God is infinite and then there is something else which doesn't extend to God's infinity, and that's where God created the world. That means God isn't really infinite, and that poses a major problem to the Jewish belief system, which is that God must be infinite. Otherwise, there just isn't God. So our belief in God, obviously that there is God, and the very definition of what God is that God is one. And again, based on the Baal Shem Tov's interpretation of what one means, of Hashem Echad, the oneness of Hashem is, not that there's only one God and there isn't a second, but that the very definition of God is one. Hashem is Echad. There is godliness, it's oneness, that's it. There isn't anything else. And that everything that exists is part of God's oneness. So then how does stuff exist outside of godliness? How can there be a revelation of godliness to something else? How can there be an extension of godliness to something else if there can't be a something else? That's essentially the question we asked. And we're going to try to answer that a little bit, but of course this whole topic really is going to be answering that question. And of course, the topic of the relationship of God and the world, and the relationship of the world with God. So let's continue with where we're actually up to from last week. So we're in the middle of chapter 21. So we're just going to translate from the Hebrew, read a little bit inside, and I'm just going to translate directly to English. So we finished off saying that God's speech is one with him, and the speech and the words, essentially, the letters that were employed, those same letters that originated in God's intellect and in God's mind, were then spoken, which means that those letters, those ideas, were revealed from godliness. And that revelation are the 10 utterances which the Torah speaks of, which the Torah writes about, that God used to create the world. Those 10 expressions, those 10 other utterances where God created all the basic fundamentals of the world. Then all of that speech is contained within godliness and is still one with God even after it's been spoken. Again, as we've been saying, when we speak, what happens is the science of speech, if you will, the Kabbalistic science of speech, is that a person has thoughts. Thoughts are made up of letters. We think in a specific language, and the language has letters and sentences and meaning. All of that is made up of letters. Once those letters take on a physical form, physical within words, within the mouth, within sound waves, that's when those words are spoken. And that is the act of revealing the thought, revealing the idea. The moment that happens, though, within a human being, the moment that happens, the speech, those words, those letters have become independent and separate from the individual. Whereas before the speech, they were one with the individual. They were inside the intellect, inside the mind, and that means oneness with the individual that's thinking. Those letters become independent once they're spoken. But when God speaks, he says, even in the act of speaking, which means even in the act of revelation, of revealing, even in the act of the intellect being extended beyond the self, outside of the self, and even after the extension has already happened and has been completed, which means, to use the metaphor of God in the world, creation is already finished, it's already done, there is existence, there is a world that operates, it's already history that there is a world. Nevertheless, those letters and words are still one, connected and one with God completely, just like they were before they were extended and revealed through the power of speech. And that is a loaded statement because it's very difficult to understand that. It's difficult because it's not so simple, but it's very, very possible to understand. So what essentially are we saying? That when God speaks, those letters that are being revealed essentially are still one with him. And that's the part we need to understand. If there was a revelation, if there was an extension from godliness, an extension of his ideas, then how is that still one with him? It's been extended. It's been expelled or ejected from the self, so to speak. That's what the definition of speech is. And that's the reason the Torah employs the metaphor of speech to intimate, to drive the point home that God created something, an additional, if you will, something in addition to himself. He created something, an extension of himself. It's not him himself. It's now something else. That's why the Torah uses speech, as we've been explaining, as a metaphor from us. That's how speech works within us. Nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe is saying that in that same act of extending himself and expressing himself, which is the speech, nevertheless, that speech or that extension or that revelation is still one with him. It's still one with him. It's still godliness. How are we to understand it? So let's read a little bit more inside, and then we'll explain a little bit. So he says, for example, like the speech and the thought of a person while they are still in the source of the power of speech, or in the source of the desire of a person's heart, before those letters have come up from the heart to the mind to think about it in realistic words and letters. Here's a very interesting psychological, scientific, Kabbalistic combination, which, of course, makes for a very interesting conversation. The Alter Rebbe says, when a person has thoughts, of course, we know this, and we've been talking about it last week. When we have a thought, any kind of thought or idea, it's a bunch of letters that are contained within the mind. But where are those letters coming from? And we explained last week, they're coming from the soul, from the neshama, which is the power, the source, the engine for everything that the body is able to accomplish and is able to do. The body itself is not alive and certainly has no skills or abilities of its own. Everything that the body can do and is able to do and does comes from the soul. So the fact that I can sit and think, right? The fact that we can sit and think, the mind isn't generating ideas. The ideas and the ability to think about those ideas, which means knowing a language and being proficient in a language, and that language containing letters, all of that comes from the soul. Once I learn that language and those letters, I can then think in that language. And the tool which does the thinking is the mind, is the brain. But where are the thoughts coming from? Where are the letters to be able to articulate those thoughts coming from? The soul. So he says, before those letters, before the ideas have even come into the mind, when they're still in the soul, which means they're still on a potential level, they're not even in a realistic level yet. They're not even in the mind. In the mind, they're still pretty real. I mean, compared to speech, the letters of the mind are very, very spiritual. They're not physical. When I speak words, they're much more physical and materialistic even. There are sound waves. There's real physics to the words that I say, to the letters that I say when I speak them, as opposed to the letters when I think them. But the Alter Rebbe says, let's go even further, even beyond the mind. Let's go into the soul, where the abilities and the skills of the mind are coming from and are sourced in, is the soul. The letters in the soul aren't articulate like in the mind. Even in the mind, sometimes we have fleeting thoughts, quick thoughts which contain massive amounts of information, which if we're actually to stop and think about a certain thought, we can, talk and talk, or even if it's not talking, thinking, but think many, many hours, which is many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of letters, which are required to think through all of those ideas. Yet we thought about it in a moment. In one fleeting moment, I had an idea. And then I processed that idea by thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, which is, again, multitudes of letters and sentences and language. Within the soul, it's not even articulate on a flash of an idea. It's still on a potential level, which means it's extremely, extremely condensed, if you will. Very, very compact. So compact that you can't even describe and say that, it's letters or it's ideas. It's in the soul, it's not letters or ideas at all. It's just potential. Once it comes to the mind, that's when it begins to take on an intellectual reality, which then becomes an idea. An idea can then become a thought-through idea, which requires lots of letters and lots of thought and lots of time. So he says, the same applies also to desire, interestingly. And I think we rarely think of it this way, but this is one of the beautiful things of learning, Tanya, is you get a lot of side benefits as well. When we have a desire, when we want something, the Alter Rebbe says that a desire, and the metaphor that's used here is the heart, right? Desires of the heart. That's kind of common language. My heart desires. My heart burns with passion. I want something. It's not the physical heart that wants, obviously. The heart doesn't have that function, but it's the concept, the point of that I want, I desire. And the reason we use the heart for desire is really because desire is passionate, it's excitement, it's heat. And the heart, of course, is the source for circulating the blood within the body, and the blood is the warmth and the heat of the body. That's why one of the reasons, at least, that we consider desires coming from the heart. Essentially, words and letters are associated with desire as well. He says, why is that? Because it's not only ideas that require letters and words, but it's the desire of a person that also requires letters and words. We don't think of it commonly that way, but this is very true. When I want something, I feel, and it's good to do like some exercises for ourselves to actually become aware of this. When we have a desire for something, even if it's something that's very common and very normal and realistic, like to eat or to drink or to sleep, to rest, to relax, to take a break, to enjoy something, obviously all things that are allowed according to the Torah, but things that we want and we like and we enjoy. Those things also have letters. They're not just feelings. The feeling is the immediate, and if you pay attention to it, immediate, I feel, oh, I need something. Oh, I want something. And then many times it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, I want something. I immediately, my hand moves and gets what I want if the thing's in front of me, right? I want a drink. Here I go. I got a drink. But what if the drink isn't here? What do I need to do? I need to get up. I need to go find a drink. And if the drink isn't in the other room or in the other side of the house or wherever I may be, I need to go and buy a drink. I need to go find a source of water or liquid. What if I don't want water? What if I want to drink something that's different? I need to figure out how to get it. And that's where desire turns into letters, because I'm now required to think about how I'm going to get what I want. The desire then all of a sudden turns into an idea. An idea needs letters to live, to exist, whether it's in the mind or in spoken words. Ideas are basically letters and words. So too is also desire, letters and words. So getting back to the Alter Rebbe's statement, the letters and the words, while they're still in the source, before even the mind and the intellect, in the soul, or before even when a person does what they want, before even the person thinks about what they want, when the letters of the desire are still within the source of desire of the heart and of the soul. So when these things are still, even before their actual letters, when they're still the potential of letters for a desire or the potential of letters for a thought, what happens then? When the letters are on the level of source, when the letters are on the level of potential, when they're still contained within the soul, within the desire of the person, before they're articulated in any practical way, what happens is those letters are literally one with their source. Whether it's in the soul or in the desire, they're literally in the source of the individual. They're part of the very essence of the person. And they cannot be described in any way. In fact, when we are now sitting and describing the source of letters and words and ideas and desire, we have no idea what we're talking about. We're only able to describe letters and ideas and desires of the letters and desires and ideas that are already revealed beyond the source. We're talking about those letters when they're ideas, and that's all what we can access. But before the level of intellectual letters, we have no idea what that is. We can't even describe it. We can't even articulate it. I'm not even sure we can feel it, even if we try. It's on the level of the soul where it's still potential, and that's why we can't access that in a descriptive way. It's just the knowledge that it exists, and that's it. Which means that on the level of the soul, on the level of the source of the soul, of the letters, which is the soul, the letters are so one with me, they actually are part of my very being, of my very essence and existence, and they're inseparable from me. Once they become an idea or a desire, now all of a sudden they take on a real potential for being separated from me. Because the moment I say the word, it's now separate. But while it's still contained within my soul, it's one with me. So, he says, so too also, metaphorically speaking, so too also, the words and the thought and the letters of God are one with him in his essence and his infinite being, not only before he spoke those words, and again, spoke doesn't mean literally spoke, but not only before he revealed himself in order to extend himself and create, but even after he reveals himself and extends himself in order to create, which again, we're calling speech, even after that action of speech, they are still one with him. Those letters and those ideas are still one with him, just like before he spoke the words, just like before he created them, as if they are still within the source of the essence of infinity, where you can't even separate letters and words and ideas. They're all one, contained within the essence of the being, and there's no difference. From God's perspective, there is no difference between before he created or after he created, before he thought, after he thought, before he spoke, or after he spoke. And this is really the essence of what we're saying here, is because as a result of this, and we're going to get back to this and explain this, or try to explain this at least a little bit more, but based on this thought, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that the world is literally one with godliness, with God. That essentially even the act of creation hasn't changed anything. God is the same God, the same infinite being that he was before creation, and he remains to be the same after creation. And even that which has been revealed in order to facilitate creation hasn't been separated from him. It's still part of him. It's still one with him. Not one with him, theoretically or any other, however else you want to put it. One with him literally, just like it was before he created it. So we're saying he created the world. He did extend himself. He did reveal himself. Yet all that revelation is still exactly like it was before it was revealed, one with him. And that's tough to understand, because when we reveal something, it's extended from us and it's gone, and we can't put it back in. When we speak, the cat's out of the bag. As we said, the beans have been spilled and you can't put them back in. But when God speaks, somehow the rules are different. Now, we can understand why the rules are different, perhaps, because we're saying God is infinite, and when God speaks or when God reveals himself, he can't go beyond infinity. He already is everything. He is already infinite, so there's nowhere to go. Theoretically, that makes sense. The question is then, where are we? How is this world, and where is this world? And how do we, fold it all up into a nice, neat package so that we can make sense of it? So some examples. And examples are very important because they deviate a little bit from the topic, and we understand something that's much more relevant to us, that can make much more sense to us, and then we take that topic and apply it to the subject at hand, which makes it much easier to understand. So let's try to do that. There is an example that the Arizal gives. The Ari, in his book Eitz Chaim, the Arizal, one of the original one of the original teachers, or at least in modern, if you can even call it modern history, in recent history, original teachers of Kabbalistic ideas. The Arizal says as follows: to take the metaphor of the ocean and a drop of water in the ocean. So if we go out and let's make a mental picture. There's the ocean. I'm sure everyone has seen an ocean before. If not in reality, then at least in a picture. We know it's very vast. It's very big. It's huge. We can't even see the end of it. Whatever we could see is really just a drop in the ocean almost. It's really just a small part of what really exists in the ocean. So the ocean is a vast amount of water. Can I remove a little bit of it? Yes. Can I take a drop out of the ocean? Yes. Literally a drop. Can I take one of those little droppers, Dopplers, what they're called, where, usually they come in little medicine bottles where you have to squeeze a little, I'm not sure what the term is, squeeze a little rubber piece, and it sucks up some liquid into the tube, and then you can squeeze it and it pours out drop by drop by drop. I'm not talking about a syringe even. I'm talking about one of those little droppers. You can take one of those and pull out one drop of water from the ocean and look at it and see, here's water from the ocean. Add that drop back to the ocean. Is there a difference before you took the drop out? Is there a difference after you took the drop out? And is there a difference when you put the drop back in? No. We all understand there is no difference. You certainly can't tell the difference. I mean, the ocean has gotten one drop less. That's obviously true. And then the ocean becomes one drop more than what it was when you took it out. There doesn't make a difference on the ocean, but let's examine what's actually happening. When the drop is in the ocean, the drop is part of the ocean. It's part of the vast waters in the ocean. Can you say there is now the drop that I just put in? It's in the ocean. Yes, you can say that. In fact, it is. That's the fact. That's the reality. The drop you just squeezed out of the tube and has fallen into the water, it's now part of this vast ocean. Correct. Can you discern and find that drop in the ocean? No. When the drop is in the ocean, it's literally part of the entire ocean, completely part of everything else. You cannot tell that there are drops in the ocean. When you look at the ocean, you can't measure, we don't measure the ocean, or we don't even think of the ocean, or even view the ocean in terms of many drops or droplets. No. It's just ocean. It's oneness, if you will. It's not many drops. It's just water. When I take the drop out, now it's not ocean anymore. Now it's not water anymore. It's a drop. It takes on its own kind of existence, if you will. It's now independent from the ocean. It's still water, right? It's still water, but it's part of the ocean. So the Arizal essentially says the ocean is made up of many drops of water. Nevertheless, since when it's contained within the water, it's not a separate, independent entity of its own. When you look at it, you just see ocean. You don't see a drop. Because besides for the ocean, there is no other existence there. It's just ocean. It's not made up of many droplets. Essentially, the point is that when you have a vast source of something, and that source has a mass amount of whatever stuff it is, whether it's ocean, so it contains tons of water, whether it's energy, whether it's the sun, for example, that contains an immense amount of light, when that either light, or in this case, water, as we've been giving an example, is separated from the source, from the actual body of light or water, that thing begins to exist on its own, but not really. because when you take that thing and put it back in, it's now completely one and part of the original where it was before. So much so that you can't even tell that it was removed before. So much so that it's literally part of the entire thing, and you can't tell, and you can't even describe it still as a drop. It's completely merged with and one with its original source, as if it never left. Which means even when you take it out, it's still part of the source. It's not separate. It's not truly independent. Again, this is a metaphor. The metaphor isn't exactly the same as what we're trying to say, but essentially, I think you've guessed what we're already trying to say. When God created the world, he's extending or revealing himself, which is infinity. He's allowing for infinity to be extended into, or being compressed into, something that's lesser than infinity, if you will. He's taking that drop of infinity out of infinity. Now, when that drop is in infinity, it's not called a drop. It's not called a creation. It's not called existence. It's not called anything. It's part of infinity. It doesn't have a name. It's infinite. The moment you pull something out of infinity, it's still infinite in its properties. It still is what it is. The drop of water, when taken out of the ocean, it ceases to be part of the ocean, but it's still water, right? The light, when it extends from the sun, it's not sun, it's light, but it's still very much part and connected with the sun. So much so that if you remove the sun, the light completely vanishes as if it was never there. So it's the same thing. When infinity creates, or in this sense, what we're calling it is speech, and is extending from himself outward, what's happening is that we're taking a drop out of the ocean. We're taking a drop out of infinity. It's still water, though. That drop is still infinite. It's a drop. It's now, so to speak, exists further from the infinity. It's been extended from infinity, but it's still an infinite in properties. It's still infinite. It still is the properties of where it came from. It's a piece, and that's why we call the soul, for example, a piece of godliness. What is a piece of godliness? God is infinite. Remember the same question we ended off with last week. God is infinite. How can God create? How can there be a piece of godliness? A piece of godliness is actually a contradiction in terms. God is infinite, a piece of infinity. There can't be a piece of infinity. Infinity is everything. Infinity is all the pieces that can ever exist. There can't be a piece of infinity. Those two are contradiction in terms. You shouldn't be able to say them, or it doesn't make sense to say them in one sentence even. Yet we keep repeating it and saying it. Why is that? Because that is exactly what's transpiring when God created the world. Essentially, it's a part of himself, which is now being extended further from the self. It's still self, though. That's the thing. That's, if you want, it's the irony of it. And, when we say no human mind can comprehend God, this is part of what we're talking about. We're trying to describe godliness a little bit, and it's like 2-year-olds discussing light speed or travel into rocket science. They think they know what they're talking about, and they might sound like they know what they're talking about, but not really. So we're doing the best we can. Okay, when I'm saying we're doing the best we can as human beings with finite minds, we're obviously very capable, but the point is, human beings cannot understand godliness because God is infinite and we're finite. But what we're doing is we're describing as best as we can and trying to understand what was the process of creation. And the reason for understanding this process of creation is then to understand what is the relationship of the world with God. And when we understand that, we can then understand what is our relationship with God. God is close to us. We said that already, and we believe that. If we believe in a God, and we believe that God is infinite, and we have the Jewish definition of godliness, then God is certainly close and loving and caring and all of those things. But what are we to God? That's essentially one of the fundamental questions that Hasidus asks. God to us is everything, but what are we to God? I think I brought this example in the past, certainly an example that my father has brought many times, and I heard from my father on a number of occasions. But the example of a parent who has a child, an infant, a baby, a toddler, whatever you want to call it, whatever really age, but at the age where, the parent is we're drawn to just the simple purity, loving and cuteness of a small infant or toddler. And the parent works all day and doesn't see the child almost the entire day, and comes home at the end of the day, and the child has already been put to bed, and the parent wants nothing more than to just see the child, but the child's already sleeping. The parent obviously does not want to wake the child. So the parent tiptoes into the bedroom, and the child is sleeping there in the crib or on a bed, and the parent just wants to just touch the child, just give the child a kiss on the cheek. That's it. And with that expresses, all of that longing and yearning and desire and want of the parent to be with the child and spend time with the child. And, there's a lot there that's expressed, that's pent up, that's built up. And then when the parent finally has a child has an opportunity to kiss that child at the end of the day, but the child is sleeping, and the parent bends down and gives the child a soft kiss on the cheek. There's a huge amount of love that's expressed in that moment from the parent to the child. But the child is completely oblivious to it. The child has no idea what just happened. There has been such an extreme expression of love that just happened in this moment. And the parent is, completely involved and taken over by this moment, perhaps even to the point of tears. So much emotion. And the child is completely unaware because the child is sleeping. So if the child would have seen the parent, the child would have certainly at a toddler age, would have run up to the parent and hugged and done whatever and kissed and do whatever the age appropriate for that child would be able to reciprocate that love to the parent. In this case, the child is sleeping. So what we're saying is that God is in a constant state of closeness with us from God's perspective. There is a love, there's a care, there's a passion, there's a devotion of godliness to us constantly. That's part of our faith in God. But we are like a sleeping toddler. We are completely unaware of it. We might believe it. We might learn about it and study about it. But do we feel it? Do we experience it? For most of us, I think the answer is no. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is trying to help us with, to be able to experience godliness, to understand that the world really is part of godliness. And everything is part of God, and not just part of God. It's literally part of God's infinite being. And as we've been saying, the world, the created world, every aspect of creation is an extension of godliness through speech, which is a revelation of the mind, which is a revelation of the soul. So essentially, the created world is a product of God's very essence and infinite existence, infinite being. And so it's like taking a drop out of the ocean. Yes, you've separated the drop from the ocean. That's true. But that drop is still part of the ocean. It's still salt water. It still contains everything that the ocean contains, just in a much smaller form. When you do that to infinity, here's the thing though, you take a drop, if you will, out of infinity. I'm not sure how that's done. Apparently God knows how to do that. But when you take a drop out of infinity, that drop is still infinite, which means it's not a drop, it's infinity. A drop of infinity and an infinite amount of infinity is the same thing. It's the same amount, because infinity can't be more or less of. Infinite means everything, everywhere, always. There can't be a certain measurement of infinity. So, and this is the part that we have trouble wrapping our brains around, us humans, that is, and understanding exactly how that operates. But essentially, with the metaphors that we're giving, with the light of the sun from the sun, or with the drop of the ocean from the ocean, that's how we're understanding. The words that God spoke and the result, which is this world, is still very much part of and connected with the source of it, which is infinity, which is godliness. And therefore, we conclude that there is no difference, again, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, even after the world has been created and the letters and words of God's intellect have been spoken and have gone from the potential of the soul all the way into the reality of the spoken word, which is a created world. There is no difference before God, before the creation or after the creation. The world remains one with him and very much part of his infinite being and infinite characteristics. And there's no difference. So is God's speech different than our speech? Yes, absolutely. Very, very different. What is then our world, and how are we to perceive and understand our world? So our world is godly, not just godly, it's infinite. The problem is us. We are the problem. The problem is that we have a certain perspective, which is a limited perspective. The problem is that we see the world and we observe and experience the world using the perspective of a finite perspective, or a perspective of limited beings, a perspective which is concealment, which is separate and independent of godliness. And that's why what we perceive is also something which is independent and separate from godliness. If we can get beyond that way of thinking, if we could, and he's going to continue discussing this in the rest of the chapter, which we'll get to next week, God willing. But the point is that we're going to end off today is that if we can get beyond that way of thinking, if we could think and perceive and truly see the world the way it truly is, which is infinite, we see limited, finite things, stuff, right? Things that exist, that have physical properties, but in reality, nothing truly exists, or all of the existence is really part of God's infinity. So there aren't really any barriers. There aren't really any limitations. It's all infinite, godly potential, all of it. And so there is really nothing stopping us from doing anything, certainly not in the spiritual sense, because as we said many chapters earlier, the whole purpose of creation was and is obviously for a Jew to be able to fulfill their spiritual destiny and do what it is that God wants, which is to continue to create the world and make the world a better place through the fulfillment of mitzvahs and the study of Torah, which is how we make the world a holier and a better and a more godly place. What does that mean, more godly place? Making the world aware that it is godly. That's the whole point. Ripping the mask off of the world, taking the falsehood of materialism away, ripping that off and saying, hey, I'm going to expose you, created world, and prove that you're not separate from God. You really are still part of godliness. You really are still infinite. And that's essentially, if we go to all the way to the end, which is the revelation of Mashiach, which truly rips the mask off the world. And that's why it says when Mashiach comes, the world, it says, Malach haaretz deya et Hashem, that the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. What does that mean? That means that the world itself, not just people within the world, but the world itself, the very material fiber and fabric of the world, of the different stuff that exists, they will all recognize and know that they are part of God's infinite reality. That means the sheetrock, the wood, the trees, the animals, the stone, the mountains and the space and planets will all feel that reality. Certainly human beings that have intellect will feel that, because at that point what happens when Mashiach comes is the facade of the materialistic world is removed. So right now what we're experiencing is really a facade. It's a cover-up. It's a concealment. It's a ruse. And so what we can do before Mashiach comes, and really in order to bring Mashiach faster, is to start living this way, to start living a little bit higher than the materialistic world is, and live a little more spiritual, and live a little with the perspective that everything is for a reason, not just for a reason, for a godly, infinite, powerful reason. And there is no real stopping. There is no real challenge or resistance. It's all just part of the facade of the world in order to facilitate this, which is, so to speak, something that which is as if separate from godliness, but really it's all part of God. It's really all part of God's oneness, which means there is really nothing that stands in our way. So my friends, it's been an hour. I thank you very much for joining, for participating. We will continue, God willing, next week with the rest of chapter 21. We might even finish, maybe not, but we might finish actually chapter 21 next week. I invite you to join, same time, same place. And I wish you good night. I wish you all the best of health and happiness. And I look forward, as always, as every day, to see you in good health and in person very, very soon. Thanks again.